with the Ader-Wynn, Hewitt, Dodson, and Scarrett firm will present the committee report. And at this time, I'll turn the floor over to Lori.
I'd first like to introduce the members of the committee, and I'll ask each of you to stand, please, as I call your name. Barton Alexander, Joy Arns, James Casterline, Marlise Chapman, Gregory England, Sanford Landris, Colleen Littell, Teresa Lukowski-Clark, and Naomi Menken. I want to thank all of you for your hard work. Some of you may agree with us that ballot measure 3 is the stealth bomber of the election season this year because it's been virtually invisible. Our committee felt that our purpose was not only to recommend a yes or a no vote on ballot measure 3, but also to help explain it because, quite honestly, ballot measure 3 is rather difficult to understand, and I have 5 minutes to try to condense it all for you. In March 1989, the United States Supreme Court held in a case called Davis versus Michigan that states under federal law cannot subject federal retirees' pensions to a different system of taxation than that to which the pensions of state and local retirees are subject. Now, for many years, Oregon has completely exempted the pensions of state and local retirees from any income taxation. At the same time, it has taxed the pensions of federal retirees. There seems to be no dispute that this system is in violation of federal law as interpreted by the United States Supreme Court. The only question has been what to do in response. In 1989, the Oregon legislature acted to pass a law which was called House Bill 3508. 3508 provided that all public retirees' pensions, and that's state, local, and federal, would be subject to the same system of taxation. In addition, in order to blunt the blow of those new taxes on retirees who are members of the Public Employees Retirement System, which is PERS, the law provided that PERS retirees could receive a refund of the taxes which they paid in the form of increased retirement benefits. A group of citizens obtained enough signatures to put House Bill 3508 on the ballot, and it is now ballot measure 3. A vote yes for ballot measure 3 would put into effect the statute that the legislature passed last year. A vote no would continue the system of taxation which Oregon has had for many years. For our committee, the consideration that tipped the balance in favor of a yes vote on ballot measure 3, was its effect on the potential tax rebate liability to the state of Oregon. As I noted a few minutes ago, Oregon is discriminating in its taxation against federal retirees' pensions. So long as it continues to do that, Oregon is in violation of federal law and is liable and is collecting those taxes illegally from the federal retirees. Under that set of circumstances, the state is liable to return those taxes illegally collected to the federal retirees. And in fact, there are some lawsuits pending right now under which the federal retirees seek to recover taxes they've paid in past years. The sooner that Oregon changes its system to comply with the mandate of federal law, the sooner it will cut off its liability to rebate those taxes to the federal retirees. And we're talking about a significant amount of money here. The rebate for 1989 and 1990 has been projected to be $61.4 million. The committee concluded that by adopting Measure 3, Oregon will be able to avoid that rebate and may also be able to avoid rebating taxes from earlier years. Now, the committee saw a number of flaws in ballot Measure 3, all of which we describe in our report. The committee also agreed that whether or not Measure 3 passes, it is incumbent on the legislature to address this issue again next year in order to come up with a comprehensive and equitable system of taxation of all pensioners. In full cognizance of all of the problems that ballot Measure 3 presents, the committee collectively held its nose and recommended a yes vote on ballot Measure 3. Mr. President-elect, I moved adoption of the committee's report.
Thank you, Lori. Do I hear a second to the committee recommendation? Seconded. We're now at the time to debate the report recommendation, which is a yes vote, as you heard, on Measure 3. Again, the microphone on my left is for those in favor of that recommendation, and the microphone on my right is for those opposing the recommendation. I will recognize City Club members at the microphones. Your time limit is 90 seconds per speaker, please, and please identify yourself before you begin. I see a speaker at one of the microphones, so I'll give the floor to you.
Thomas Lee, member of the City Club. I'm speaking against the report. The law that the state legislature passed is nothing more than another version of the old shell game. You try to guess which shell the bean is under. The state taxes its retirees under this law, and then it pays it all back with interest in the hopes that that will fool the courts into thinking that it gives equal treatment to federal and state retirees. In this case, the hand is not quicker than the eye, and the courts will likely hold that a tax rebate for some is not equal tax treatment for all government pensioners. So I think we would do the public a favor by voting no on the report and no on ballot measure 3, and tell the legislature to get back to work and solve the problem. Incidentally, I'm not opposed to a raise for state pensioners. They probably deserve it, but this law is a tax rebate, pure and simple, so I'll have to vote no on this.
Thank you. I see a speaker at the pro microphone.
B.J. Seymour, City Club member. One thing that we do need to be aware of is that state pensions, PERS pensions, were originally set at a lower level based on the fact that if we didn't have to pay state taxes on them, we would come out all right. If we now do have to pay state taxes on them, we need some kind of balancing measure. I don't like the measure very well either. I think it would have been better if the legislature could simply have raised PERS pensions and then taxed them equally with federal pensions. But this is best we've got right now. As the committee presenter pointed out, it will save us paying very large amounts in response to lawsuits by federal retirees, and I urge a yes vote on the measure.
Speaker at the con microphone.
I'm Philip Saxton, City Club member. In reviewing the list of people that the committee interviewed about this subject, I noticed that probably 3/4 of them were opponents of the measure. And I just wanted to ask the committee, why couldn't they have interviewed an equal number of people, both for and against?
I'll call on Chair Lori Bauman to respond.
Little confusion, sir, about what an opponent is, actually. Are you saying people who endorse a no vote?
That's an opponent, yes.
Most of the people we talked to actually endorsed a yes vote. The people who endorse a no vote are the federal retirees, and I believe I'm accurate in that.
Right. The federal retirees are against the measure.
Correct. And your question was why we did not talk to more opponents?
Yes, more opponents, people who are against the measure. The federal retirees will vote no on it.
Correct. We had some trouble finding more opponents, to be quite honest with you. I feel that we called extensively to people involved in pensioners' issues, and most everybody we talked to came out with a yes.
Well, there's some 350,000 of those people in the state.
And I believe we spoke to the representatives of the federal retirees.
I see a speaker at the pro microphone.
Chip Greening, City Club member. I rise to urge a yes vote on the report, and I compliment the committee on its action in holding its nose, as you said. The measure has its warts, to be sure, but let's make no mistake about whose ox is being gored. Tom Lee spoke about doing the public a favor. What we're doing, if we don't pass this measure, is doing a favor to federal retirees in their lawsuits. The fact is that the people who sought this initiative, who got it on the ballot, are the federal retirees. They got it on the ballot purely for the purpose of knocking it out so they could preserve their claims against the state. I don't think the state is in a position right now to kick out even more damages to the federal retirees than it's already liable for. So I urge the City Club members today to vote for the report. Thank you.
Having suitably gored oxen with warts, are there further speakers either pro or con? Seeing none, I'll call for a vote. You've each been given, as you came in, a yellow voting card to raise at the appropriate time. We have tellers to count the votes if it appears that we'll need to, and if anyone would care to call for a division of the House after the vote has been taken, I'll certainly entertain such a motion if it looks like it's a close vote. So at this time, we'll vote on the City Club Committee recommendation, which is a yes vote on ballot measure 3. I'd ask all those who are in favor of the committee recommendation to raise their cards. Would all those who are opposed please raise their cards? Fairly clear to me that the measure has passed and that the committee recommendation is adopted as that of the City Club. And at this time, Laurie, I want to thank again you and your committee for very hard and dutiful work to the club. Now on to the speaker for the day. But preliminarily, our board host is Pete Baer, City Club Treasurer and Loan Officer for National Mortgage Company, and he will have the privilege of asking our speaker the first question at the close of his address. The second question will be asked by Gretchen Biener, a member of the Government and Taxation Standing Committee. As always, we open up the meeting to questions from City Club members in the audience after our speaker's prepared remarks. I would remind you again, questions are intended to end with a question mark. Stump orations, to a limited degree, of course, are okay, but please try to make it a question and not go on too long if you do have a question. Preference is given to questions from the microphone. Written questions will be asked as time permits, and you'll see on your tables there are blanks in which to submit written questions. Hand them to City Club staff members if you have them. Our speaker today, Tom Throop, and I guess you could call him Mr. Commissioner on a couple of different fronts. From 1979 through 1986, though, he represented a Central Oregon district in the Oregon House of Representatives. Throughout his 8 years in the legislature, he served on committees that dealt with land use planning and the management of growth and natural resources. Being from the Bend area, of course, he would be naturally concerned with land use and natural resource issues. Since 1987, Mr. Throop has served on the Deschutes County Board of Commissioners. He now chairs this board of Oregon's second fastest growing county. In August of 1989, Commissioner Throop was appointed Commissioner of the Land Conservation and Development Commission, LCDC, the 7-member panel that oversees Oregon's statewide land use planning program. Tom Throop lives near Bend with his wife Karen, who is a co-founder and curator of natural sciences at Oregon's High Desert Museum, and with their 2 children. So, planning. Do we have too much? Do we have too little? Are we just not doing it right? Or is everything hunky-dory in land use planning? To give us a look at land use planning in the 90s, I present our speaker, Commissioner Tom Throop.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to participate today, and good afternoon, and I bring you greetings on behalf of your friends and neighbors in the Central Oregon and Deschutes County area. It's an honor to represent this afternoon the state's land use planning program and also Deschutes County. And would like to again introduce my wife, who's here this afternoon, Karen Talbot Throop, who's a Portland native and again is the co-founder and curator of the High Desert Museum in Bend. 20 years ago, rapid growth presented a real and unprecedented threat to Oregon's environment and way of life. Governor Tom McCall pointed an accusing finger at sagebrush subdivisions and coastal condominium and declared that unlimited growth and unregulated growth leads to a lower quality of life for all of our citizens. The Oregon legislature responded to Governor McCall's dramatic words and powerful leadership by enacting the Historic Land Use Act of 1973, more popularly known as Senate Bill 100. That landmark legislation created the most extensive statewide program for land use planning in the nation. With Senate Bill 100, the state called for all of its 241 cities and 36 counties to join it in a partnership for planning. Together, state and local governments would develop a mosaic of local land use plans which would be state approved and which would be designed to manage Oregon's growth. These plans would conserve farmland, forest land, and natural resources, such as fish and wildlife habitat, scenic countrysides, and also to stop urban sprawl. Plans would lower the cost of urban services and protect land needed for residential, commercial, and industrial development. Deschutes County and the Bend area had the potential for being a perfect illustration of the problems that Governor Tom McCall and the legislature wanted to prevent in Oregon. And I think fortunately many of those problems have been prevented. While Oregon's population is again growing at twice the national rate, a look at Deschutes County, Oregon's favorite recreation destination, is indeed an eye-opener. In the past 20 years since 1970, Deschutes County, fueled primarily by rapid growth in the Bend area, has had a population increase of almost 170%, or approximately 5% a year if you compound it, or 8% a year if you do not. From 1970 to 1990, we grew from 30,000 population to 80,000 population. Prior to Senate Bill 100, sagebrush subdivisions were a big reality. During the 1960s and early 1970s, some 25,000 lots were created in Deschutes County alone, many on unbuildable lands. Public services were a newly bladed, non-maintained dirt road and business cards for a well driller and a septic installer. It took more than a decade to complete the statewide network of plans, but by 1986, the mosaic was completed. Today, all 277 cities and counties in Oregon have adopted comprehensive plans and land use regulations that meet state standards. That accomplishment has been widely acclaimed. Oregon's statewide planning program has won 4 national awards, and several states have adopted planning programs modeled after ours. A steady stream of visitors, calls, and letters to LCDC from all over the world comes to us with the same 2 questions. Does Oregon's heralded land use planning work, and what changes in the program does your experience suggest? These are questions we as Oregonians are asking ourselves as well as we enter a new decade of rapid growth and multiple threats to our quality of life. My answer to these 2 questions comes from the point of view of a legislator who helped mold the program throughout the era of state acknowledgement of local comprehensive land use plans, as chair of one of Oregon's 36 county boards of commissioners who implements the program at the local level, and as a member of the Land Conservation and Development Commission that oversees Oregon's land use planning program. Now, while the answer to the second question, change is needed, comes throughout the rest of my remarks, my answer to the first question, does the program work, is an unequivocal and an enthusiastic yes. The program is not perfect. There are a host of big problems, issues demanding attention, and parts of the program remain incomplete. But on balance, Oregon's planning program is a marvelous achievement. The principal planning tool is the urban growth boundary that's drawn around the 241 incorporated communities, directing urban development inside UGBs and preserving rural lands for rural uses. The planning program has enabled Oregonians to conserve farmlands, forest lands, and natural resources that are central to Oregon's environment, economy, and quality of life. Planning has reduced the costs of public services and urban development. The program zones lands, reduces conflicts, has in place a predictable framework to make land use decisions, and provides for public participation, an appeals process, and then strict timelines for decisions at every step of the process. Decisions are quick in most cases, and in complex cases, decisions are made quicker than in neighboring states. Decisions are made also based on standards and criteria, so the process is objective and equitable. To provide a second opinion about the success of the program, let me offer a suggestion that may surprise you. Don't ask an environmentalist, ask a developer. More specifically, ask a developer who's done business in California, Washington, or one of our other neighboring states, and then has also done business in Oregon. And this is what you hear. Permits are faster. The Oregon system is decisive. The greatest benefit is certainty. An applicant does not have to go back and plan or replan every time a new project is undertaken. Oregon is more predictable. Here we know where we can build and where we cannot, what we can build and what kind of public services to expect. In most places, it takes a year to get approval for a subdivision or multifamily housing, but here it takes 120 days or less by state law. But our tools are largely untested. Since acknowledgement of local plans 4 years ago and since the recession ended 4 years ago, Oregon's population is again growing at twice the national average. In areas such as the Portland metropolitan area, the Bend-Redmond area in central Oregon, the Medford-Ashland area in southern Oregon, and Brookings on the south coast are growing at rates up to double the state average. Much work remains to be done. Number one on the list of issues to resolve is the long-standing and complex package of rural lands issues. At the present, our farm and forest protection policies do not distinguish between types of resource lands. Land is either farm or forest land, or it is not. No distinction is made between land that is highly productive and land that has little potential for productivity. The same generic type of zoning is applied to both. As a result, some of our best farm and forest lands are underprotected, and some of the least productive lands, secondary lands, are overprotected. After 4 years of paralysis since acknowledgement, the legislature has funded 2 important rural land studies, the Farm and Forest Lands Research Project and the Secondary Lands Pilot Program. The study on farm and forest lands protection will tell us the rate at which new homes are being built on farm and forest lands and whether or not new dwellings and new land divisions in our farm and forest zones are consistent with our policy to protect these lands. The study will provide the Commission and the legislature with the evidence necessary to adequately determine if changes need to be made in protecting farm and forest lands. Now, in conjunction with the Secondary Lands Pilot Program, LCDC has proposed criteria to identify secondary lands. Deschutes and 5 other counties are now testing the criteria and reporting the results. In the next few months, LCDC will be using that information to draft a proposal for secondary lands policy. The proposal will be presented to the legislature during the 1991 legislative session, and if all goes well, after 4 years of indecision on how to manage rural lands, the legislature, the Commission, LCDC, and the Department, DLCD, will have the information necessary to finally complete next year the framework for decision-making on rural lands. And it's crucial to finally get the rural lands issue behind us so the state's planning program can move on to the other critical issues that are facing Oregon. The planning program's next major issue is urban growth management. The 1989 legislature authorized a detailed study of urban growth management tools. In spite of LCDC staffing limitations, the urban growth management study, addressing what I consider to be the #1 issue facing Oregon, is underway. The study examines urban planning in 4 urban and urbanizing areas: the Portland metropolitan area, Bend-Redmond, Medford-Ashland, and Brookings. These case studies will give Oregon, for the first time since we've adopted land use planning, the opportunity to gather data on how well the program is working in urban areas and give the Commission and the legislature needed policy direction on urban growth management. The data is preliminary and there are no clear patterns yet, but let me give you one sample of a problem we're seeing in growth areas of the state, and that we refer to as urban leakage, where too many homes are getting built on too large parcels that are served with few urban services just beyond urban growth boundaries. This UGB leakage is a problem for a number of reasons. We're witnessing a terribly inefficient and costly use of public facility dollars. A city spends millions of dollars on sewers, streets, and water, and then new homes are built on parcels which can never meet urban density standards and which go on septic tanks, gravel lanes, and wells just beyond the urban growth boundary. That quasi-urban development just beyond the urban growth boundary is likely to prevent annexation by the city and block the extension of urban services for decades to come. The urban growth management studies and the issue papers on the 3 key urban growth management issues Oregon needs to come to grips with: annexation law, infrastructure finance, and land tax policy, will be completed by this December and ready for the next legislative session. The next major land use issue concerns transportation planning. Some argue that our statewide planning program precludes construction of major transportation facilities, and there's a policy vacuum in terms of transportation planning and development. The facts don't support this argument. The Oregon State Highway Division successfully completed 146 projects in the decade from 1978 to 1988. Only 2 of their projects in the last 15 years have been what engineers refer to as no builds. These are the Mount Hood Freeway, which even those of us from Bend believe to be a brilliant decision which brought us light rail, and the Roosevelt Freeway in Eugene. The West Side Bypass and other proposals have made it clear, however, that the Transportation Commission and LCDC need to strengthen the policy linkage between land use and transportation planning. Therefore, LCDC directed staff last year to begin working on rulemaking to clarify that partnership. We've been working closely with the Department of Transportation and with local governments in that rulemaking. We'll see some new effective policies next year merging transportation and land use planning. More than any other single factor in Deschutes County, Oregon's land use planning is responsible for protecting our long-term prosperity and quality of life. From the 1970 to the 1980 census, 10 years ago, Deschutes County grew by an astounding 103%. Washington County was second at 35%. Peak development during that decade occurred from the years 1977 to 1979. And in 1977, we had 5,000 building permits which were issued in Deschutes County. Some dwellings require multiple permits. The following year in '78, we had 7,000 building permits, the highest number ever granted. The state was then hit with the deepest recession since the Great Depression, and by 1982, we fell to 1,400 building permits. But 10 years later, 1987, we were back to 5,000 building permits. In 1988, we returned to that historic high 7,000. Last year in 1989, we issued 10,000 building permits, and that will be followed by another 10,000 building permits this year, more than any other place in the state with the exception of the Portland area. On the surface, Deschutes County is appearing to again be careening out of control, but state-acknowledged local comprehensive land use plans have worked extraordinarily well in keeping urban development inside urban growth boundaries and directing development to sites that are compatible with existing uses while reducing conflicts. But it will take the Bend area 10 years to catch up with the public facilities and services requirements that the growth excesses of the past 3 years have produced. Our schools have outrageously large class sizes. Pilot Butte, as an example, is the largest junior high school in the state. Pilot Butte is a wonderful school with a great faculty and extraordinary students, but it's absolutely stretched to the limits. Literal gridlock is projected for Bend's highways and streets by the late 1990s. Citizens' support at the polls guarantees that the state's $38 million Bend Parkway project will be built, a 4-lane limited-access arterial through Bend with overpasses at key intersections. But $12 million must be raised locally in order to connect city and county streets. Sewer, water, and drainage systems are far behind in development, primarily because new development escapes annexation and connection to city services. Park holdings are expanding dramatically, primarily due to cooperation from entities like the City of Bend and Deschutes County, but there is not 1 cent for park development. Affordable housing, especially for families who are working in the lower-paying commercial sector jobs, is in a literal crisis. Jails and community corrections programs are at absolute capacity. In the information age, we're still using libraries which were built decades ago. States such as Delaware, Georgia, Florida, Hawaii, Maine, New Jersey, Vermont, and others have all adopted parts of Oregon's program. Oregonians now need to listen to our own indicators and learn from the states who have both identified our big major flaw in our program, allowing new development to get ahead of public facilities and services, and listen to those states that have gone beyond and corrected the flaw in our program. The Urban Growth Management Study will frame the next big issue for the state's land use planning program. If we are to prevent our urban areas from sprawling across countrysides, a la the Southern California model, public facilities must be in place before new development is allowed. We simply must stop allowing new development from getting ahead of public facilities and services. Urban growth boundaries have also been an extraordinarily effective tool and must be protected and expanded only when needs are clearly demonstrated. Every day, I'm appreciative that Oregonians are stewards who balance private property rights with future generations. The issue of statewide land use planning has been on the ballot statewide 3 times in 1976, 1978, and 1982. We're fortunate that each time Oregonians have voted decisively to retain Oregon's renowned land use planning program. If we have the courage to take the next 2 bold steps, tying new development to public facilities and services and protecting urban growth boundaries, Oregon's land use planning will succeed. And indeed, it's been a pleasure to participate this afternoon and talk on Oregon's planning program coming of age and some of the issues we'll face during the 1990s. And again, I bring you greetings from those of us who live east of the crest. And at this time, I'd love to respond to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Throop, very much. At this time, I will put the floor open to questions from City Club members. Please go to either of the microphones. I think they're both live, and identify yourself when you ask your question.
Commissioner Throop, I'm Charlotte Schwartz, a City Club member. Where do you see the borderline between regulation and the taking of property?
Well, it's probably, frankly, not a matter of where I see it, but it's a matter of where the courts see it. And the courts have been extremely clear on that topic. And if there is use of the land which a private property owner retains, it's not a taking. So zoning land, determining what are appropriate uses for land are clearly within the purview of state government and local government and the kind of cooperative program that we have here in Oregon.
Gretchen Beener, City Club member and member of the Government and Taxation Committee. A major review of urban growth boundaries will be coming up shortly. What policy issues will the LCDC be confronting in deciding whether or not to expand urban growth boundaries in a given location?
Well, I think first of all, as I mentioned during the earlier remarks, LCDC and the legislature have not had the opportunity to assess how well urban growth boundaries have worked since urban growth boundaries were adopted. And we're enthusiastic about the legislature spending the $250,000 to fund the urban growth management study, because that's one of the pieces of information that we will receive. And specifically, we're going to want to find out how well have urban growth boundaries worked. Urban growth boundaries were originally established to try to provide enough land for urban uses for individual communities for a 20-year period to the year 2000. And has that worked? Has there been sufficient land within urban growth boundaries for the variety of residential, commercial, industrial uses or not? Is there fine-tuning that's needed on those urban growth boundaries? It's plausible that some of the results might indicate that urban growth boundaries worked well from the view that we had during acknowledgement back when that started through 1986, but circumstances may have changed and there may need to be some fine-tuning of those urban growth boundaries. But I don't think we'll have the answer to that question until the study results are in. Is there enough land for those kinds of developments, residential, commercial, industrial, or do we need more land? There is a process in place clearly for expanding urban growth boundaries. In fact, we've had applications since acknowledgement for approximately decisions at the local level to expand urban growth boundaries 77 times. 51 of those have been approved. So it seems that system has worked. But the urban growth management study will give us some additional information. A little too early to predict specifically what it'll be.
I neglected to recognize our board host, Pete Bear, for the first question. My apologies, Pete. Would you please proceed to ask your incisive and devastating prepared question of our speaker?
Well, after that, I doubt that it will be sharp or incisive. Commissioner Throop, your comments about the infrastructure in the Bend area prompt me to think of one of the criticisms of the system when it was first devised, and that is a shortage in personnel, particularly in local planning departments. Given sustained economic growth, and I think it's Oregon's turn for that, given the fact that budgets are going to be tight even if the tax limitation measure is defeated, and given the fact that many communities just don't have the staff to do the planning function, how are we going to orchestrate needed changes in the plans, the land use plans, and ensure quality development in the state?
Well, that's an extremely timely question. As a matter of fact, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, looking at the statewide point of view first, had 68 employees, or no, that's not correct, 59 employees at the peak back in the 1979-1981 biennium. Currently, there are 42 staff people statewide within the Department of Land Conservation and Development. The smallest natural resource agency by a long shot, 2-year budget of $7 million. As comparison, the next smallest natural resource agency is the Division of State Lands, which has a budget of about $29 million. A full 50% of that $7 million that the state legislature grants to the Department of Land Conservation and Development to run the state land use planning program is then turned around and granted out to local governments in the form of local grants. So $3.5 million stays at the state level, $3.5 million goes out to help the state or the local governments with their planning efforts. There will be some recommendations coming from the Commission and the Department to expand our staff and capabilities during the next legislative session and for the 1991-1993 biennium. And unless there is some opportunity for expansion, there will not be staff and will not be capability to do the work that we need to implement the changes necessary to protect primary farm and forest lands, to implement secondary lands, to implement the recommendations of the Urban Growth Management Study. A number of local governments, as you indicated, among cities, among counties, have very limited planning staffs and need capability there, rely very heavily on the grant dollars that come from the state to do those planning functions. And it's simply a program that's been underfunded during the last few years. In fact, my analysis during the recession, I think the land use planning program was in some paralysis. It was having difficulty coming to grips with the major issues that were on the plate. We weren't experiencing rapid growth, so there wasn't the compelling need to have the effective land use program that we had during the mid and late 1970s. And some of the, let's say, more rural and conservative legislators who were concerned about loss of local control and some compromise of private property rights were successful in punishing the program by withholding very necessary resources for us to be able to implement these functions that we're talking about and describing. And if the 1991 legislature does not come to the grips with the fact that the state's land use planning program is seriously underfunded, we'll be extremely limited in our capability, both at the state level and at the local level, to come to grips with implementing the policy decisions we make on rural lands, as well as the obvious policy that we'll need to implement for urban growth management. So, Mike, we're going to need your help in 91.
Ken Duker, City Club member. A three-part question, Commissioner. What proportion of those building permits you mentioned are being issued in rural areas? 2, is there political will to reduce that number and to concentrate the growth in urban areas? And 3, do you have the capacity to build the infrastructure within the urban growth boundary to accommodate those numbers?
Very complex set of questions, and let me try to answer. Statewide, we have approximately 40% of the dwellings outside city limits. In Deschutes County, it's 61%. I think there are 5 or 6 counties in Oregon that actually have a higher percentage of dwelling units that are outside of city limits, but we're very high in Deschutes County at 61%. And the primary reason we're that high is because of those 25,000 legal lots, many of them legal lots, which were created prior to the advent of land use planning. Sagebrush subdivisions were a reality and happened in many places in the state. And those lots are still being, those that are legal lots of record are still being built on. And there's still a tremendous backlog there. I think the program is doing a good job of limiting new subdivisions in the rural areas, but again, we still have that backlog. I think there is the political will in the faster growing, more urban or urbanizing communities to reduce the number of dwellings out on rural lands and specifically on resource lands. Frankly, I think we still have some problem in some of the slower growing counties and some of the rural areas of the state. And frankly, without a state land use planning program, I don't think we would have any consistent and comprehensive ability to limit the number of land divisions and dwellings out in rural areas. So I think the state program is absolutely essential if we as Oregonians embrace the goal of protecting farm and forest lands and trying to concentrate urban development within urban growth boundaries. The biggest inhibitor, frankly, to the extension of infrastructure at this point in our area is the very antiquated and archaic annexation laws that we have in the state of Oregon. Frankly, legislators who are protecting areas just outside of urban growth boundaries have been or outside of city limits, have been very successful over the years in preventing the legislature to make any meaningful change in annexation law. And in many areas of the state, a logical extension of public facilities and services is dependent upon the ability to annex those lands to the city so the city can provide those services. Now, I recognize in some parts of the state there are special districts who have the capability of delivering those urban services without annexation to cities, but let's recognize that most places in the state that's not the case. And until we come to grips with annexation law and allow areas outside of city limits to be annexed so we can have a logical, progressive extension of public services, we're going to have a very difficult time coming to grips with the facilities that that new development requires. I think all of those issues that you described will become paramount after we, for the first time again, see the results of our urban growth management efforts since the advent of land use planning in Oregon. And I'm certain on those three questions that you described, we will have very clear policy direction. And whether or not the legislature and in turn local governments have the political will and initiative to do what's required, I think is still up in the air.
Okay. Peter Wilson, Land Use and Transportation Committee. Commissioner Throop, you mentioned that a majority of voters statewide have voiced their support for the program in several ballot measures, but in rural areas, LCDC has very strong opposition, and I was wondering if you see any ways to strengthen support for the program outside of metropolitan areas without compromising the program.
I think the program has been getting increasingly stronger support from rural Oregon. I think it's becoming more and more important to rural Oregon that the farm and forest economies of the state are extremely important to our future. And I think more people in the urban area and the rural areas where we have a lot of that prime farm and forest lands are beginning to come to the conclusion that without a consistent land use planning program, those lands would not be protected, but would be divided, and the resource capabilities on those lands would be lost. The department has also worked hard to try to help some of those rural communities with their economic development efforts, zoning appropriate and adequate industrial lands, working with the Oregon Economic Development Department and trying to make certain that land is zoned properly for industrial development, that infrastructure is extended to those lands, and that prospects that are interested in locating in rural areas have that opportunity. Frankly, I think there are a lot of people who live in rural areas who believe that individual landowners should be able to do anything they want with lands that they own, and I think there is a portion of the populace out there that will probably never convince that they should give up some current options for their land in order to protect long-term prosperity and quality of life and to provide for future generations. So I think there is a group of the populace out there that we're probably never going to convert and will never be supportive of land use planning. But I think if we can keep the state and local partnerships as they're improving, keep those in operation in the future, that some of that resistance will be reduced. And I think a prime example of that is the folks who are the strongest opponents of land use planning have not put a ballot measure on the ballot since 1982. And they're probably more organized now than they've ever been in the planning program's history. And you don't see them coming forward with a ballot measure because I think they know that Oregonians would substantially reject it. So I think we are making some progress in rural areas.
Ned, look, member, considering the transportation gridlock that we already have here, or beginning to have here in our metropolitan area, and anticipating that it's coming to Deschutes County, I wonder if you favor taking the gas tax money and using some of it proportionately for mass transit.
Absolutely, yes. In fact, if you look at the transportation goal, the land use planning program's transportation goal, it very clearly states that the state should work to reduce our transportation dependence on single modes of transportation. And all 7 members of the commission, the department, embrace that very strongly. I'm convinced that the Department of Transportation, though they're primarily in the business of roads and highways, also embrace that concept. And I note that Mike Holleran, who's a chair of the Transportation Commission, also a Bend resident, strongly supported the ballot measure that was defeated in May. And I personally strongly support mass transit and believe that gas tax revenue should be used for it. I think my strategy would be to come back to the ballot every single election with that same measure until Oregonians adopt it. Because I think in principle Oregonians approve that concept and support the idea of gas tax dollars being used for more than a single mode of transportation. But I think there was sufficient confusion and a lack of exposure to that concept that I think we need to come back. If it takes 2, 3, 4 elections in a row, I think we ought to encourage the legislature to do that because it's the right thing to do, and I think eventually Oregonians will support it.
Thank you very much.
Tom, Dan Goldie, member. You made a very important point about the critical relationship of the local communities having adequate funds to deal with their infrastructure problems in order to keep the integrity of this land use planning program alive. Now, in addition to ballot measure 5, the local communities are facing a major loss of revenue. There are bills pending in Congress which, if enacted, would, the estimate is, reduce federal timber sales here 90%. 90% of $272 million is an elimination of about $240 million going to the counties for schools, roads, and similar things. My question is, if that happens, what then happens to the land use planning program in this state?
Well, certainly that's a difficult and vexing problem for all of us, but frankly, there probably will continue to be changes in the future that we're going to need to make adjustments to. If the resource is not there to continue the level of production that we've had in the past, to produce these sources of revenue that we've had in the past, we're simply going to have to pull together collectively as Oregonians and figure out how we're going to progress in the future. You know, one alternative, the lottery has a number of different programs. It's kind of been all things to all people. Maybe the lottery in the future should be dedicated exclusively to infrastructure development. Maybe the lottery should provide those public facilities that new growth and development is going to require. But I think the bottom line on the question, if it isn't there to cut and it's not there to produce the revenue, we're simply going to have to pull together and look for some different options. And Oregonians have not shied away in the past from very difficult issues like that, and we'll probably have to take those on again. Ballot measure number 5 would be absolutely devastating. I assume that City Club is pretty conversant on that. You have a debate coming up in the future. But not only does ballot measure 5 just cut property tax dollars for schools or property tax dollars for municipal local governments, but it also takes away many of the urban growth management finance tools that we currently have in place, and would be another major blow to our abilities to extend infrastructure for new development. We have some difficult issues here. I strongly believe that public services and public facility issue is the #1 component to the urban growth management problem, which is the #1 issue facing Oregon, and I hope that that's a very serious topic that Representative Mike Burton and the other 89 legislators will take on in 1991.
Dennis Cusack, member. As I understand it, the primary mechanism that the program has is through the establishment of planning goals, not a state plan itself. Would a state plan, a more specific state plan, be helpful? Would it be effective? And would it also help coordinate or facilitate the coordination between various regions in the state? And would it help reduce some of the competition between those regions?
Well, personally, I like the Oregon system. Hawaii has the kind of system that you're describing, and I believe Florida may have evolved into that kind of a system as well. I like the Oregon system where we do establish statewide goals, and then each local government in the state is required then to meet those goals in the development of a comprehensive land use plan, to where that planning effort occurs at the local level, takes into account regional and local differences, and reflects local values. I think the Oregon approach is the best approach. Now, certainly the issue you raise of coordination and consistency is probably the problem that is most serious to address in not having a statewide plan. But I think the Oregon system has done pretty well in providing for that kind of coordination. And if you look at most cities' plans, most counties' plans, there is a lot of parallel provisions in those plans, and I think are relatively consistent from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and county to county. I'm an unabashed supporter of the Oregon process, which has the state mandating local land use planning consistent with statewide goals. And I think it would be difficult, frankly, to sell a more state-centered concept in Oregon.
Mary McCarthy, member. Should a golf course be an accepted use of agriculture land?
Golf courses are currently a conditional use on exclusive farm use lands. We're having numerous golf courses proposed throughout the state of Oregon on productive prime agriculture and forestry lands. In Deschutes County alone, we have some 10 18-hole golf courses that are currently on the drawing board, most of those on productive farm and forest lands. Washington County must have a similar number. I, for one, believe that golf courses are not compatible with exclusive farm and forest lands, and that golf courses should not be located on exclusive farm and forest lands. They should be inside urban growth boundaries, on exception areas, or in what eventually will be adopted as secondary lands. The biggest problem I have with a golf course is not necessarily the golf course itself, but the biggest problem I have with a golf course is after that golf course is built and developed, there's the expectation, even the presumption, that it will then be surrounded by dense urban housing development. And I don't know of a golf course in the state that's proposed without some desire to have mass residential development around it at some point in the future. And that's a difficult question. There's no question about it. It will be before the 1991 legislature, and whether the legislature will have the collective courage to come to grips with that issue is still up in the air. But I personally think that golf courses should not be permitted or conditional uses on exclusive farm or forest lands.
We have time for a final question.
Gretchen Lashley, member. Commissioner, what's your opinion of charging developers in high-growth areas, not just for the development fees, but for social service fees to help pay for some of the social problems, or perhaps you do that already?
We're just moving into that in the Central Oregon area. There are a number of jurisdictions in the state, and as you describe, in the higher, more rapidly growing areas that do have what's termed systems development charges. And those systems development charges are charges that are charged for developers prior to development for a range of urban services that new development will require. The 1989 legislature did approve a statute which prescribed how those systems development charges would be established by city and county jurisdictions statewide, and then essentially limited that list to sewer, water, wastewater disposal, transportation, and parks. I personally think there are two other items that ought to be on that list for local consideration, and that's schools and housing. and believe strongly that systems development charges are important for developing areas of the state if we are to keep pace with the urban services that new development requires. And I believe those systems development charges ought to be levied against developers, and those funds ought to be generated for the development of those public facilities, because it's unrealistic to think that the local governments with the tools that they have in place and the state government with the support and federal government with the support they provide can put together enough resources to be able to amass the services that are required. It is a laborious process to justify the kinds of charges and the amounts of charges needed. We currently have contracted with an engineering firm in the Bend area in Deschutes County to do that study for us, and we anticipate establishing a set of systems development charges July 1, 1991. It's not the panacea. It will help. My understanding, if ballot measure number 5 passes, there will be no opportunity for systems development charges. That will be taken away from local jurisdictions as a tool. So I think that's another urban growth management reason to oppose ballot measure 5.
Just briefly to re-announce, we'll be meeting next Friday again in the U.S. Bancorp Tower here on the 41st floor to hear Breaking the Cycle of Illiteracy and also to debate 2 rather charged ballot measures on recycling standards and on school choice. As we adjourn, please join me in thanking our speaker, Tom Throop.